Do you get excited about taking tests? Does the idea of your sermon being evaluated by your peers and your professor just thrill you? The reality is, for most of us, we don't like tests because we don't like the idea or prospect of failure. But God uses tests in the Bible for a different purpose. Tests don't come with a percentage, they're pass-fail. And tests are not for God to learn something about you that he doesn't know yet. God knows what the outcome is going to be. He's God. God gives tests for you to learn something about yourself and your faith. So it's really gracious of God whether we pass or fail a test that he gives, because we learn something that we can act on the next time that a similar opportunity arises for us to act on our faith. But if we fail to learn from a test, when an opportunity comes up, we're not going to act any differently. In Mark chapter 6, verses 32 to 56, we see the disciples' faith put to the test in a wilderness and on a stormy sea. And surprisingly, the outcome of the story is the disciples failed the test, and they failed to learn from the test. But Mark has included this story for us so that we would learn from the disciples' failure. Today we want to talk about how do we as Jesus' disciples carry out the kingdom assignments that he's given to us. And as we explore and experience the disciples' failure, we're going to see three characteristics of disciples who carry out their kingdom assignments. So let's look at the disciples in this story. The two major scenes in this story are commonly summarized as the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walks on water. But the way that Mark tells the story puts the emphasis more on the disciples than on the miracles. At the beginning of both stories, Jesus sends the disciples away from crowds in boats. And in both stories, the disciples find themselves in a harder situation than where they left. Deserts and wilderness are a common kind of theme setting for testing, and storms are a common on the sea are a common setting for adversity and hardship and danger. And in both stories, we see Jesus expect the disciples to use the kingdom authority that he's given them, and they fail to do so in both stories. If you recall, up to this point in Mark, Jesus and his disciples, he's demonstrated for them rebuking a storm. He's rebuked demons, and he's rebuked authorities. And he, at the beginning of chapter 6, gives them the same authority to do so and sends them out to cast out demons, taking no earthly resources with them. So when they come back, that this story begins. Jesus sends the disciples with the disciples away to rest in a desolate place because they're tired, and that makes sense. But we find out that a crowd goes before them and interrupts and frustrates their plan. And when they get to land, the disciples try to get Jesus to send the crowds away. And Jesus, in his response, indicates that he's giving them an opportunity to exercise the authority that he's given them. He says, you give them something to eat. Jesus wasn't just giving an empty idea that was setting up this amazing thing that he knew he was about to do. He wanted the disciples to succeed in using their kingdom authority to meet a need of these people. But instead of that, the disciples focus on what they don't have and how much money that would take and their limited resources and that sort of thing. Then in the second scene, when Jesus sends the disciples away, again in a boat into a sea, he says, go before me across the sea to Bethsaida, which is northeast of where they are. But at the end of the story, they end up southwest of where they left off. So not even close, because they decide to row harder into a storm than to use the same authority that they saw Jesus use in a storm in Mark chapter 4. We know that this is a test because Jesus stays on the land praying while they're alone on the sea. And it says that at evening, he sees them out on the sea struggling, but it's not until the morning that Jesus comes to them, walking on the water. Jesus is giving them an opportunity to use their kingdom authority that he's training them to use, but they fail to do so. And because they're focused on their own effort and there's hardness in their hearts, as we're about to learn, they fail to see the King of the earth walking on water past them as a means of encouragement. Instead, they're terrified and they think it's a ghost. It's probably easier for me to say that they failed than for me to say that I would have done the right thing in that situation. But Mark is drawing us into the story to ask these questions of, do I use the kingdom resources made available to me to carry out the assignments I've been given by Jesus? And do I know how to? As we seek the answers to these questions, we'll see three characteristics of disciples who carry out their kingdom assignments. The first characteristic is that disciples discern and then turn from human thinking. The key to understanding the disciples' experience in these two scenes comes at the end of the second story, the second scene on the boat. When Jesus gets into the boat with them and the wind ceases, we're told that they're amazed and astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. We know that their hearts are hardened because the narrator tells us, but the disciples don't yet realize this. And because they don't realize that their hearts are hard, when they're put in a nearly identical situation in just a couple chapters, they fail in that test as well. And when we fail to see what's in our hearts and learn from the test that God gives us, it stunts our faith. So let's look at what's in the minds and hearts of the disciples in these two scenes. In the first scene, we see disciples demonstrating human thinking by the questions that they ask Jesus. When they come to him, asking him to send the crowds away, Jesus wants to shepherd the people, and they are primarily seeking their rest. They're tired. And I think Jesus is probably tired too, but he's thinking in a different way than the disciples are. They want them to go away to find something for themselves to eat. And when Jesus gives them the opportunity, he says, you give them something to eat, their response demonstrates another human way of thinking. They're thinking in terms of the resources that seem scarce to them. They say a year's worth of wages wouldn't buy enough food for these people. They see what Jesus is asking them to do as impossible because they're focused on the scarcity of their resources. It's a human way of thinking. When Jesus presses them a little bit further, they find out that they have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Maybe they were even trying to preserve what they had so that if the crowds went away, they still had something to eat. It's a human way of thinking of rather than finding an opportunity to serve other people, they're keeping things secure for themselves. In the second scene, we see the disciples demonstrate human thinking when rather than rebuking the wind, they just row harder. And we know that their effort doesn't get them any farther or closer to their goal by the end of the story. Rather than turning to heavenly resources, they dig their oars in deep, and a lot of people respond like that in adversity. Just try harder. But when our mindset is focused on human ways of thinking, we might miss Jesus walking on water next to us. And it's not something that causes faith and courage, but fear and worry, because we think it's a ghost. So what are the ways that you limit the possibilities of what God is asking you to do by thinking in human ways? Are there things that you limit what God could do? Are there things that feel impossible because of the scarcity of resources? Are there people that God has brought to you that you would rather just send away for somebody else to feed? Are there things that God has asked you to do that seem impossible to do? My wife and I, we live in Boulder, Colorado, and we've lived here for 5 years working with college students. The average price of a home in Boulder is $1 million. We don't have $1 million. It seems impossible. And so we've been asking God to provide a home for us. But in the 5 years that God has not answered that prayer, I think that he's been showing in my heart that I've been thinking in a human way. I've been limiting what God could do through us by saying, God, we need a house to do that. And I think he's saying, no, I'm not limited by you owning a house. I'm thinking in a human way in that instance. And sometimes when I consider that I'm a father and a husband, and I'm a seminarian, and I'm in ministry, I can become overwhelmed by all of the things that I feel like I need to do. And there are some times where God, I think, leads me to evaluate, are there things that I've taken on that maybe he hasn't given me the assignment to do? And there are other times where God leads me to evaluate how I'm trying to fulfill all the things that God has assigned me to do. For example, at the end of a long day of discipling others and working on assignments and that sort of thing, I get home, and that's just the beginning of my day of ministry to my family. And they're going to get my scraps if I'm thinking in human terms. But if I seek God's resources, they can experience his riches. Emotional energy is a precious commodity in kingdom ministry, but God's banks aren't scarce. So we see that disciples discern and turn from human ways of thinking in order to carry out their kingdom assignments. But what are we turning to? Well, that's the second characteristic. We think in kingdom categories. We see the disciples demonstrate human thinking in the story, but we see Jesus demonstrate thinking in kingdom categories. When he steps off the boat and sees the crowds of people who have frustrated their plans, he's not bothered by it. He looks at them and he sees them like sheep who need a shepherd, and he has compassion on them. He sees the opportunity to feed them, and he wants to, because he knows the kingdom that's coming, that's at hand. He knows what's possible in that kingdom, and he believes it, and he acts on it. In the second scene, we see Jesus demonstrate kingdom thinking, and thinking in kingdom categories, when he uses his kingdom authority to walk on water, because in God's kingdom, nature is not a threat to God's people and the things that God has asked them to do. He believes that and he acts on it, and he demonstrates kingdom thinking, or thinking in kingdom categories, when he's walking on water, ultimately to serve the disciples and encourage them, to show them, look what's possible. It's evident that Jesus sees the world differently than we do. He looks out on the world in light of God's kingdom, and he says, people should not be without leaders. In God's kingdom, the people have leaders. There's not land that is barren and not providing abundantly for God's people. There isn't scarcity of resources. Nature isn't a threat to God's people. It's the way that Jesus sees the world differently. And for us, we need to cultivate and learn to think in kingdom categories. And I think a way that we can do that is by looking at what's wrong in the world and agreeing with God that it's wrong, because we see the kingdom that's coming. When we see people being treated unfairly and unjustly because of the color of their skin, we need to look at that and say it's wrong and agree that it's wrong. When we see a virus touching every country on the earth, we can agree that it's wrong, that this tiny particle is going awry in the world. And when we look at how it's adversely affecting poor people physically and economically more than other people, we need to look at that and say that it's wrong and agree that it's wrong. But we can't just agree that it's wrong. We need to see and respond like Jesus does and act on the resources, the kingdom resources that God has given us. And that's the third characteristic of disciples. They utilize his kingdom resources. The failure of the disciples in this story is highlighted by the arrangement of the crowds at the beginning and the end of the story, who are literally running to Jesus. They believe that he can help, and so with simple faith, they come to him for help, and they bring others to him for help, whereas the disciples are struggling with their faith. Now, saying utilize kingdom resources is easy to say, but maybe hard to do. And maybe you're left wondering, should I be calming a storm? And should I be feeding thousands? Is that what God is asking me to do? And is God always going to provide the resources for these assignments? Maybe. But I think it's important to note that these are the assignments that God gave the disciples to do. And while the kingdom categories remain the same from age to age, the expression of the kingdom assignments that God gives to us vary. And so for us to say that we have to do the same thing as the disciples in these stories to demonstrate we utilize kingdom categories or kingdom resources might be presumptuous on our part. I think we also need to ask a hard question of our hearts and say, is this for my gain and benefit, to make me look good, that I want this from God? Or is this to benefit others? It's consistent in the Gospel of Mark and in the Bible that God's kingdom resources flow through people to benefit others. Jesus doesn't calm the storm in Mark 4 before he falls asleep. He doesn't feed himself before he feeds the crowd. He doesn't just zap divine energy into himself so that he can do it. No, he puts their needs before his own. James says this when he says, there's some things that we ask for that we don't get because we ask with wrong desires. And I think sometimes God leads us into seasons of testing in the wilderness or on the sea in order for us to see the wrong desires that are in our heart, causing us to ask for things that are not good for God to give us. Now, practically, I think you've probably heard a lot of sermons on prayer that our application is to pray. And I'll unashamedly be another. I think we undervalue prayer and we don't view it with the power that God does. Lately, I've been trying to pray in kingdom categories. A ministry friend of mine came to me because he's looking for housing. Their lease is going to expire at the end of August, and they want to move closer to the campus that we minister to. And an opportunity came up closer to town, a 1-bedroom, cheaper than where they were. But the landlord wants them to move in immediately, which would cause them to pay late termination fees and all that kind of stuff. So I tried giving some advice and that sort of thing, but later I thought to pray with God's kingdom in mind. I imagine God's kingdom where there's not a scarcity of good housing for people. Resources aren't limited in God's kingdom. And so I said, God, would you bring that kingdom into my friend's life? The next day, my friend messaged me and said that the new landlord offered to cover their first month of rent entirely. And their previous landlord said that they would let them end their lease early with no termination fees. Don't underestimate the value of prayer and what it gives you access to benefit the needs and meet the needs of others around you. Just leave the how to God. Don't tell God how he has to answer the prayer. Let's learn from the failure of the disciples. Let's discern and turn from human thinking that's in our hearts. Let's think in kingdom categories and see the world that Jesus sees. And let's utilize the kingdom categories that have been made available to us so that we can carry out our kingdom assignments.